So today on BeyondPhrenology, I'm joined by Dr. John Krakauer. He's a John C. Malone Professor of Neurology, Neuroscience, and Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation at Johns Hopkins University. He directs the BLAM Lab, Brain Learning, Animation, and Movement. It's mostly focused on learning how we move, what goes wrong after stroke, and how we drive recovery. John is also an external professor at the Santa Fe Institute in New Mexico. And he has also co-authored a book called Broken Movement, The Neurobiology of Motor Recovery After Stroke, a very important book to read for anybody interested in movement. John, welcome to Beyond Phrenology.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, John, I would like to, start with your career trajectory. You have been in neuroscience for almost 3 decades now, and your work has transformed a lot during that time. And we'll go into specific debates and topics in your wide interest later. But I want you to, track some of your experiences, especially as an autodidact and polymath, given your interest across, not just in science, but also arts and music and history and everything.
You mean try and explain how I got there or what the trajectory was?
Yeah, I mean, what your trajectory was and how it led to the evolution of your thoughts about, the brain, neuroscience, movements over time, because you definitely don't think the same way, when you started, right? Like all of us. And
No, no. I mean, I think when you start, right, you have to have that core of independence, I think from beginning early on, because it's not as though you get rebellious later in life. I think you have to be rebellious early. So
okay.
I think I was lucky in so much that I was able to pursue questions that were always puzzling to me
Mhm.
uh, from early on. I mean, I was very lucky. I had, mentors and protectors when I was at Columbia, and then when I moved to Hopkins, I was more senior. Even when I was an undergrad at Cambridge, I met incredible mentors who were very curiosity driven. It was, I think about it a lot now in retrospect, just how remarkable some of the people at Cambridge like John Gurdon and Mike Bates and Malcolm Burrows, incredible zoologists, biologists, Mike Berridge. They were
Hmm.
all sort of extraordinarily curiosity driven, feeling for the organism biologists. So
Hmm.
I think that was very inspiring to me that they had a kind of Darwin-esque exuberance, you know.
Yeah.
They didn't seem at all like people who were worrying about metrics and impact factors and H indices, and
Hmm.
they just didn't give that vibe off. Now, I mean, I was just an undergrad, so it could well be uh, that I was, shielded from those realities, but they just seemed to be very deeply into what they were doing. And I met people like that along the way when I was a medical student at Queen Square. David Marsden was a huge inspiration, just this neurologist, neuroscientist who was just fascinated by movement disorders. So I think there were those early sort of influences.
Hmm.
I think the fact that I wanted to I did neuroscience as an undergrad, but then I was going to be a neurologist as a doctor. So I would say one huge influence with me was just seeing lesion patients. In other words, very much the tradition of neuropsychology, Luria, and others.
Hmm.
I think the modularity of the brain was so unequivocally obvious if you just spend any time looking at stroke patients or lesion patients. In other words, a major influence on me has been lesion-based neuropsychology, right? I think it kept me grounded, actually. Um, and I am always struck by a lot of people who think otherwise about the brain, have never actually met a patient, which I find kind of problematic. Um,
Okay.
so I think that sort of the biology of
Hmm.
Cambridge versus the neurology of Columbia were two things that had a lasting influence on the neuroscience I was doing. Do you see? In other words, the neuroscience, I was very interested in the motor system, as you know, and studying control and studying learning in healthy humans. But that kind of systems or behavioral neuroscience in healthy subjects was always tempered by, the way that people did biology in non-humans and the way that you did neuropsychology in patients. Do you see? They were always
Yeah.
there as
Hmm.
kind of correctives to just floating off into uh, modeling and experimenting in healthy
Yeah.
subjects and with theories. And, there have been some very interesting people who've talked about this, like Tim Challis beautifully has written about the difference between learning your principles from lesions in patients versus trying to derive the same principles from imaging, for example, healthy subjects,
Mm.
right? And
Yeah.
that there was a new form of cognitive science which would not require natural experiments of lesions, but you could actually do good experiments in healthy subjects with imaging and other forms of manipulation of the nervous system like TMS and things like that.
Mhm.
And I've been very much struck by the way that isn't always as effective, although there are remarkable people who do imaging that really do make strong neuropsychological discoveries, people like Nancy Kanwisher, Ed Fedorenko, Jorn Diedrichsen, who do imaging so well that they really do allow you to have insights along the levels of lesions. And then, of course, all of them also look at lesion patients. So that's really, I think, where my biases and predispositions come from. And then what I would say after that is, what I realized studying patients with motor lesions, whether it's Parkinson's disease, cerebellar disease, or stroke, is cognition and movement are very different things. In other words, there's always been an intention of bringing cognition down a notch or two and say, well, there's intelligence in the sensory motor system, and really that's where you should go looking, and that will be where insights into what you call cognition come from. And what was very unusual for me is, having studied the sensory motor system, I realized that was not where you were going to get insights that were easily extrapolatable to cognition. So then I basically began to be interested in what I call the cognitive motor interface, and the difference between thinking and moving, and realizing that there are all sorts of um, treacherous minefields when you try and borrow concepts from either side, and then they infiltrate, often without you seeing, into the other one. So I've been very much aware of that also. So, and then that interest in the cognitive motor interface then led into getting increasingly interested in AGI, AI, beginning to do work with large language models. So it was quite a evolution, really. But in a way, paradoxically, being interested in the healthy and damaged sensory motor system made me realize that that body of work was not going to be what taught you about the cognitive system lying on top of it. And so my sort of allergies are to anything to do with embodiment. Any people who say that everything is distributed, uh, those fashions tend to frustrate me a little bit because they're just not what I've observed.
Hmm. But aren't these everything is this or everything is that comes more from from people from philosophy in general, like uh, rather than actually people who are working with full organisms.
I think, I'm not here to bash philosophy because I'm very fond of philosophy. I think
Yeah.
there's a difference, I think, between, how should I put this? Trying to derive scientific insights via philosophy,
Yeah.
which I think can get into all sorts of trouble,
Hmm.
versus the rigor of philosophical thought brought to bear on what scientists have said, right? So in other words, those two things are
Hmm.
different to me. In other
Yeah.
words, I think that when you look at the way terms and concepts and words are used by neuroscientists, I think philosophers can say, wait a minute, these things aren't consistent, they're not completely coherent, they don't really quite make sense. That, I think, a kind of cognitive cleanup.
Hmm.
When you try from the philosophy side saying, okay, I believe that language is essential for thought, and you come up with all sorts of notions like that, that doesn't really work, right? You have to do the empirical work, right? I'm always struck by the number of people who think that the key to human cognitive capacities is language, but that's not because they've done any real work on, let's say, aphasia patients. It's
Hmm.
just, it seems to them that that just seems clear that that should be the case, right? In other words, there, I think there's a real problem when you're trying to sort of think your way into what the system is doing. Yes, I think that you can be critical of philosophers, but on the other hand, they can really help show where one is not being consistent, logical, and also think about things that are being thrown off by scientists. Like Hasok Chang says, there's a lot of stuff that's happening in science that scientists don't have the time to attend to. And the philosophers can sort of look at those extra things. And that's why he calls it complementary science, that you're looking at stuff that the scientists are not considering a priority, even though it's stuff that they have made. And it might be of a form that is more conducive to philosophizing about. So those are the three flavors, right? Just doing cognitive cleanup, looking at things that the scientists themselves don't have time to really worry about, and then trying to derive things through thought experiments, where I think that's a little bit more dangerous. I think it's led to uh, problems, whether it's uh, linguistic arguments about knowing how and knowing what, or sort of linguistic arguments around what emergence is, linguistic arguments around what thinking is. I think the language turn in philosophy has tried to extend itself into all sorts of areas of science, which I just don't think have worked that well.
Hmm. Do you think that changing though, given that words have become so cheap, especially with large language models, uh, that there isn't a lot of incentive structure now for words, right? It has to be grounded in some ways, to for it to survive the storm of empirical evidence.
I don't know. I mean, I have this idea maybe that because human thinking, meaning, language, which were always considered so special and led to a certain human centrism and all
Yeah.
that, that in a sense, because even language itself has ended up being proceduralized,
Hmm.
at the very moment that happened, it dethroned this magical link between human thought and language to the
Hmm.
point where the large language models are so impressive that maybe these special extra qualities are sort of illusory. They're like the ether that they were being touted, and yet look what's happening with large language models.
Yeah.
Maybe they are basically showing that all these special things like meaning, understanding, and are like the ether. We don't need them.
Hmm.
So
Exactly. Yeah.
I, I find it kind of fascinating that that's happened. Um, I mean, I completely disagree with it. In other words, just to recap what I'm saying, you've got the sort of deflationary basal cognition sensory motor argument to dethrone these kind of special things that people
Hmm.
claim humans. And then you've got the large language model version, which was language was special. Even the sensory motor people had to admit that only humans had it. So there had to be another way to deflate and dethrone it. And along came
Yeah.
large language models, and they've done their way. So now you've dethroned intelligence by having a sensory motor story for it,
Hmm.
and you've dethroned language as
Hmm.
the core to human thinking. So in other words, the demolition is almost complete in a way,
Yeah. One has to
right?
accept it. Yeah.
Yeah, and we don't need to talk about thoughts and representations and all these things. We've taken care of those by showing that they can be sensory motorized away or they can be LLM'd away, right? And now I think that that's completely wrong. And then you throw in a little bit of Wittgensteinian language games. Language is just use, meaning is just use, a sort of slight misunderstanding of late Wittgenstein. But he seems to basically be proving large language models, some people might think, prove Wittgenstein's language game view of meaning. And so you've got this, as I said, you've got this sort of total demolition of a kind of cognitive specialness.
Mhm.
Um, and it's kind of delicious to watch if it weren't so wrong, right?
Especially if you don't have stakes in it, right?
Well, I just don't agree with it. I just don't think that you end up with there's being no there, right? So um,
Oh,
it's just fascinating to watch. It's just interesting to watch this deflationary program.
and what comes
Even,
in terms of the
even though
defense
I'm
as
not
well?
saying, even though I'm not saying it's some sort of conspiracy or it's some
Yeah.
kind of, I'm just saying that there's a lot of deflation around.
Mhm. Of course. But wasn't it obvious from the beginning? Because so when you talk about patients with lesions, and it was very obvious that certain functions are modular and cannot be fully distributed. Uh, isn't it obvious by looking at people who had like speech disorders, for instance, like people work very well, without vision. What does it do with our theories of vision, right? People work well without speech. So we have all kinds of disabilities or lack of abilities, and in quite a large percentage of population, if you actually look at the real stats of disabilities across different populations. So wasn't it obvious that those those capabilities were already very inflated in the cognitive neuroscience literature because of a specific focus on able-bodied individuals from the beginning?
But I'm not quite following. In other words, everyone is rightfully terrified of degenerative diseases in neurology and psychiatric diseases. In other words, the two things you don't want to do is, lose your mind through degenerative disease like Alzheimer's or frontotemporal dementia, right? Where the
Hmm.
first things you lose are concepts and thoughts and everything else is intact. In other words, semantic dementias are terrifying, right?
Hmm.
Um, and then psychoses, right? Delusional disorders where you're just not thinking right. So in other words, people are terrified of significant psychiatric disease and cognitive disorders because they don't want their thinking messed with. That's what most people are most frightened of, right?
Yeah.
And they're right to be because these diseases target that special thing that humans do. And I would argue that the fact that there are diseases that target them prove their existence, right? In other
Yeah,
words,
of course, of
if
course.
if you have something beautiful and fragile,
Hmm.
there'll be something specially created to destroy it,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And it and I think that the fact that you can be motorically completely intact and have frontotemporal dementia, or you can be completely cognitively intact and be locked in and not be able to move anything, proves the complete independence and modularity of these systems.
Oh, okay.
I mean,
Yeah,
Dominic Bobie, when he wrote The Diving Bell and the
yeah, yeah.
Butterfly,
Uh-huh.
right? He was there, completely locked in, and wrote an entire novel, right?
Yeah,
And
but
and
wait,
that novel
yes.
came completely from inside his head. It didn't come from anywhere else.
No, so I, as to functioning independently, yes, but there's modularity, but if you bring in the development, for instance, into account, then definitely, I mean, there is some kind of divergence over time, or does it have to be independent from the beginning?
I don't, I always think people always say, well, what about the development at the beginning? I'm perfectly okay with an interesting origin story. But, you know, if you're a really good nephrologist, a really good kidney doctor,
Hmm.
and you ask that kidney doctor who's looking after patients with renal disease, do you know the full evolutionary developmental story of where kidneys come from?
Yeah, and it's not needed.
And and it's not needed.
Hmm.
And what I'm saying is that that's true from the inside as well. In other words, what I want to know is how did Dominic Bobby write his novel lying there paralyzed? How come that part of his body, that part of his nervous system was completely healthy,
Yeah,
right? And it was operating even though he couldn't do anything sensorimotor, basically,
yeah.
right? And so that's interesting, right? How does he conceive and blink out a whole book, right? Uh, no other animal species can do that, right? And the question is what is that thing? And it's not just language, right? His conception of his fate as a locked-in patient was not created by his language network. His language network was used
Hmm.
to express what he was thinking,
Yeah,
right?
of course.
And so, in other words, if you think that large language models to some degree have properties that are similar to the language network, Ev Fedorenko and others have done seminal work talking about properties of the language network and how separate it is from the cognitive networks, and that large language models share representations with what's going on in the language. That's all very interesting. But you're left with wanting to know how the cognitive bit works. And the language network is not the cognitive bit, and the sensory motor system is not the cognitive bit. So we need to now think hard about what the cognitive bit is doing. And, there are people who do a lot of work on prefrontal cortex, right? But a lot of that seems to me to be hydraulics of prefrontal cortex. How do you stay on task? How do you switch sets? How do you use working memory? Um, those are the mechanics of the use of the content. They aren't themselves theory of the content,
Hmm.
right? They are
Hmm.
they
Yeah,
are it's a beautiful, beautiful work on how you manipulate representations. It's not telling you how you make the representations in the first place.
yeah. Okay, that makes sense.
And how did Dominic Bobby start thinking about his childhood, right? And all the things he did before he had his pontine hemorrhage. Uh, where did all that rich phenomenological content, how did it get laid down, right? So he
Hmm.
could,
Yeah,
in his
yeah.
death, as I said, blink it out. In other words, it's kind of extraordinary, right?
Hmm.
That yeah, and we know from seizures and from electrodes that you can force thoughts and images from only a few places in the brain, going back to Penfield, and those are temporal lobe and frontal lobe. That's it,
That's
right?
true. Yeah.
That's where hallucinations and well, you can get those in occipital lobe, but the formed ones, the very formed ones, plus the forced thoughts. So we know where Dominic Bobby's thoughts are coming from, right? A few parts of cortex. And we may have lots of experiments that help us understand how you switch between thoughts, how you maintain thoughts, how you prevent distraction, and all those things. but where the actual content is and where it is before you retrieve it, the format it's in before you retrieve it, and the format that it's in when you use it, I mean, it's just still, it seems to me, a
Yeah,
mystery.
it's elusive, yes.
But as I said, I can't help thinking that even though you've just said, yes, I see what you mean, but there is a tendency to try and sensorimotor or, as I said, LLM that component away. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah, that's
it's
true. That's true.
right.
Yeah, I agree with you. Okay, so
So that's where that's where I've gotten to is a sort of a fascination
mhm.
with what it is that allows you to be lying there in a dark room paralyzed and come up with an entire book. It's very odd. Right?
So what's the other side of this coin? So how would you frame similar arguments for the sensory motor capabilities?
Well, I mean, you know, as you and I, as you know, you've met, Adrian Hayth, who was in the lab and became a colleague, and he and I have talked a lot about, like you have also talked about, well, what was the bridging concept? What was the thing that would kind of let you go from movement to thinking, right?
Hmm.
And I think the bridging concept, the one that has really gotten people excited for quite a while, is this internal model argument, right? That somehow, and there are people, for example, Nick Shea, the philosopher, when he wrote his book, Representations in Cognitive Science, I think that was the title of his book, he very much borrowed from the sensorimotor internal model concept for the bridging idea to then thinking about cognition, right? And I think hiding inside that bridging concept of the internal model was the notion of simulation,
Yeah.
right? And simulation, the model-based idea is extremely powerful, right? You have a model, and that model allows you to simulate, and that simulation allows you to consider alternatives. And if you allow for an implicit version of that, like animals navigating mazes, then you go, look, if we can solve the problem of search and simulation in the implicit version in non-human animals, then that must be the beginnings of understanding the more overt version in humans, right? So I think, in a way, the link between cognition and movement has been the notion of an internal model where you can simulate, whether it's a forward model, generative model, replay, rollout.
Mhm.
Uh, I think that's the link that some people make. And then, of course, there are the anti-representationalists, anti-cognitivists who say you don't even need to have that bridging concept. Just consider thinking a form of locomotion, right?
Mhm.
Which I,
No, but
you
who
know,
are but who are those? And so I think that's where that's also a straw man, because I don't know personally of anyone who thinks like that.
uh,
It, it's it's
if you were to read um, Rodney Brooks, right, the roboticist,
yeah, yeah,
he explicitly says that.
yeah. Maybe he took it too far, because the for instance, Gibson
And
never
then
said that.
there are others. Uh, Varela and others who also made
Yeah.
statements like that.
Okay.
So, in other words, I'm not going to be super. I mean, we could just go and do a little quotation hunt.
Mm-hmm.
you could find many people who are anti-cognitivist, anti-representational, uh, and when you have people who think that a bacterium is intelligent and that you are going to derive general principles of intelligence from even inanimate things, right? Levin makes these points over and over again,
Yeah.
right?
Right. Right.
So,
So it's
so,
going too
so I'm
small
not quite
or
sure.
yeah.
Yeah, so I'm not quite sure that I agree with you that this is a
Okay.
straw man. I think that there are people who
Hmm.
think that these are all that essentially believing in representations and content and semantics. Hoagland famously said, take care of the syntax and the semantics will take care of itself, right?
Hmm.
And you could say that that's a little bit like saying, take care of the sensorimotor circuitry and the rest will come for free.
Yeah.
So
So
I
so
do think that,
uh,
and I say that I think that people who are too cognitive,
uh-huh.
I think for many people are just sounding like folk psychologists.
Yeah. I agree with you. I mean, a lot of neuroscience and psychology is still folk psychology.
But they will consider the terms of cognitive science just a slightly more sophisticated sounding folk psychology,
Hmm.
right? And
Yeah.
and I just find that ridiculous. I just don't think that's correct, right?
Hmm.
Let's not ground
Hmm.
intelligence in psychology. Let's ground it in biology, right?
Hmm.
And let's have a biological bottom-up version of it rather
Yeah.
than a top-down human psychology version of it.
But that also doesn't work well, right?
Well, I don't think so. I mean, I'm not, I think the best thing about science is there's pluralism, that people should work on what they want to work on.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that I just find that there are varying flavors of anti-cognitivism, and I think that one of the reasons about it that happens is it's so hard. We don't really have a theory yet of overt deliberative thought. I mean, if you read Dan Dennett, who, I was lucky
Hmm.
enough to get to know a bit, and you read his to but from Bach to Bacteria and back,
Yeah.
that that book is a remarkable psychodynamic object where you see him wrestling
Hmm.
with the fact of overt deliberative thought
Hmm.
and really, really wanting to take it down a peg or two, right?
Hmm.
And in the end, he admitted that its existence. He even admitted, he had said it to me, that it was unique to humans, but he thought that its components were culture and language. In other words, he found a way to say that it wasn't anything intrinsic to human cortex versus, let's say, chimpanzee cortex. It was
Hmm.
because humans were invaded by culture through language. So, in other words, and that's why he wrote so much about memes. He thought, yeah, if you take
Yeah.
basically chimpanzee cortex and you find
Mhm.
a way to
Yeah.
parasitize it with culture via language,
Hmm.
thoughts will ensue without having to invoke any intrinsic new capacity,
It's kind of absurd.
right?
Yeah.
But that was kind of the move, which is how
Yeah.
do I
Uh-huh.
both admit to a uniqueness but simultaneously manage a deflation?
Right.
Do you see?
Right.
It's
Right.
almost, I think John Searle, who no one's allowed to talk about anymore, sort of said this in his, I think, what was it? Cognition Reconsidered, or what was it? Where he sort of says that coping with this issue that we're talking about right now itself induces a weird form of cognitive disorder.
Hmm.
That people get weird when they're talking about this. It's
Yeah.
it's almost like that people can't quite deal with the reality of something, and therefore they either deny that it exists or say that it's something else than what it actually is. It's like these two strategies simultaneously.
Hmm.
Consciousness does not exist, or it's just this, right? In other words, it's
Yeah.
two ways of bringing it down, right?
Hmm. Yeah, yeah.
It's
Right,
fascinating. Yeah.
right, right. Yeah, either it doesn't exist or you put in a box, a very specific
Yeah.
box, and
You have to
consciousness
you
is
find
just,
it,
yeah.
yeah, you just find a way
Hmm.
to kill it or make it a very vanilla version of the original that no longer has the property that you were fascinated by in the first place.
Hmm. Well, but why do you think there's so much of fascination about these concepts like conscious, these overarching concepts, kind of very ephemeral and no specific definition. It could be anything across the whole science
But
community.
I'm not sure. I always say to people, if you just substitute in the word pain for
Same, yeah,
consciousness,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
No one denies the existence of pain,
Hmm.
right? When people commit suicide over pain,
Yeah.
right? So, in other
Hmm.
words, what's the problem with being interested in pain,
Hmm.
right? It's
Hmm.
just, Colin Klein, the philosopher who's really great, has, written a lot about pain, and I've spoken to him, and it's a complex issue, but and Dan Dennett, we were talking about, wrote an incredible essay early in his career about would a computer ever feel pain,
Hmm.
right? Those are interesting questions. What
Yeah.
happened, my belief is what happened is that consciousness was such a difficult thing because it was a first person ontology. And when people talked about the mind, what they really were saying, in my view, was conscious deliberative thinking. People said, well, let's forget about consciousness. So let's sort of peel that away and let's just talk about cognition. Now, cognition, a lot of it can happen unconsciously.
Yeah.
So basically, what happened is you peeled off consciousness, then you basically saw all this impressive intelligence and cognitive feats being done implicitly and unconsciously. And so eventually, the divide became permanent, and people said, well, third person science on cognition is where we should go. It looks like you can have all sorts of impressive cognitive feats done by computers. We're not claiming they're conscious. And so maybe we can go all the way and just be implicit cognitive, and the rest is all illusory and unimportant,
Hmm.
right? So you can almost see what happened, right? It was you can see what happened. They split,
Yeah.
and conscious deliberative thought became less important because it's hard to study. And so let's just do implicit cognitive neuroscience. Some people go into studying consciousness, but their combination becomes less important.
So on that note, do you think, going back to the deflationary forces about cognition or language, LLMization and, sensory motorization, what do you think of are there any deflationary forces on sensory motor capabilities? Like what about robotics, for instance? We thought of balance and a lot of, balance related, performance related, uh, or just a performance, very unique to humans or very unique to, bipedal stands or certain kind of control. Now we have robots, for instance, doing marvelous, motor performances, and they're getting better and better at it, right? They might not do a lot of things yet, but we don't know where the limit is. So,
Well, to the degree, I mean, I don't have a problem with artificial lungs, artificial hearts, dialysis machines,
mhm,
right? So the fact that a lot of physiological function can be performed by non-biological tissue,
yeah,
and if you consider the spinal cord and the brainstem for a moment as biological tissue, just like the kidneys are biological tissue and the heart is biological tissue,
Yeah.
and that you can use non-biological tissue to do the job, I'm not so, why should I? Now, when it comes to developing a skill, like being a tennis player or a good mountain climber, those are highly cognitive activities, right? I mean, if you look at that amazing film, Free Solo, when Alex Honnold goes up El Capitan without ropes, and you watch that documentary, the most fascinating part of that documentary for me, which seems to go less commented on, is he kept taking notes in a book about what he was doing.
Hmm.
I mean, what was all that note taking that he was doing about ostensibly a sensorimotor task of climbing the side of a mountain?
Yeah.
He was thinking offline a lot
Hmm.
about it,
Yes.
right?
Hmm.
So, to the degree that every sport worthy of the name, whether it's Formula One racing or tennis or mountain climbing, is an extreme cognitive activity, then robots aren't going to be able to do it, right? Unless we as humans program in certain sensory motor flexibility, which, as I said, why on principle should we not be able to make a synthetic spinal cord like we can make a synthetic, kidney? I don't really know what all the problems about. I think what's interesting is to understand how a hierarchical system works. I mean, it's fascinating how locomotion works in a spinalized cat or a decerebrate cat, or how long latency stretch reflexes work, or how the stuff you do on the board. Those are fascinating things. That's really interesting sensory motor neuroscience. But that's just a continuation, in my view, of the Sherringtonian project, right?
Hmm. So
That's a
what's
stretch
new?
reflex.
Then what's new? So what in motor neuroscience is beyond Sherringtonian project?
Well, I mean, for example, I'm particularly interested. I would love to know how descending systems from different motor areas um, interact with each other, how they project onto the spinal cord. And for example, very let's take stroke. Why is it that I can make smooth movements with my arm,
Hmm.
and then you lesion the corticospinal tract, and you end up with Humpty Dumpty breaking into the same pieces every time? You have a weakness part, you have a dexterity part, you have a synergy part, you have a spasticity part. No one would have guessed a priori that when the system falls apart, it would fall into those pieces, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Why does it go wrong in that way?
Yeah.
Why does, why is it that when you have degeneration of, you know, stridonigral connections, that you get the problems that you get? Why do they fall apart into tremor, rigidity, bradykinesia, and the other thing? I mean, it's bizarre that when the system breaks, it breaks in a particular way, right?
It's not
And
bizarre because if you're thinking of system as like a blocks on top of each other, then they might not break in a certain way. But if a system has an internal structure which is like a tent, for instance,
like
then
a
it
what?
like a tent, like a specific
Mhm.
kind of a tent, then it has to break in a certain way out of,
Yeah, I know, but I can intuit how a tent, when it breaks, how it will break. I'm just
yeah,
saying that if anyone were to invite an alien from outer
uh-huh,
space, let's show them what we know about the healthy nervous system,
hmm,
the
yeah,
projections to the spinal cord and the connections, and go, tell me what will happen when I sever the cortical spinal tract.
yeah,
What will be the resultant behavioral
hmm,
abnormalities? I'll not be able to tell you.
no,
And the question is why not?
right,
Right? And so in other words, I'm fascinated by work that I'm doing with Stuart Baker and psychophysical work we've done with many colleagues, is why do you have the components you do of the abnormality and what is their anatomical and physiological basis. In other words, and we're learning that. In other words, you said what's new. I think we're beginning to have a sense about the organization of these descending systems and the nature of their interaction. And it's, in a way, you could argue a continuation of the Sherringtonian project, but there's a lot still to find out about stretch reflexes, long latency stretch reflexes, and descending pathways. And I find that very fruitful, right? The whole population level analyses that are going on and on at the moment. I think when you look at work by Stefano Fusi, who's been a friend of mine for a long time, and he shows fascinatingly that there are these geometric representational structures in hippocampus and elsewhere that have the right structure to do the kind of context-sensitive dissociation in the tasks that he studied, and that neural networks seem to be able to construct such, that neural networks can suck up like a vacuum cleaner structure in the world and recapitulate it somehow for use. That's fascinating. I mean, that is the neuroscience project. How come cortex has this ability to re-represent external structure in some implicit way for use? It's amazing. That is amazing, right? In other words, when David Foster does those beautiful experiments where there's latent learning in various mazes by the rodent, and then they one shot navigate from the entry to the exit through those barriers that they previously latently internalized. That's extraordinary. I mean, that is extraordinary, right? So there's a lot we're learning, right? We're learning, the unique contributions of cortical areas compared to brainstem and spinal cord areas. It's very exciting. I think the problem is that even all that beautiful empirical work is sometimes a little bit contaminated by the wrong concepts to think about them. Right? So you can do beautiful work on eye movements and stretch reflexes and long latency stretch reflexes and central pattern generators and maze navigation. And it's amazing, but there's a tendency to, as I said before, take all that behavior and use the notion of internal model, which, as I said, is a very good bridging concept between the cognitive and the motor. And it begins to sort of have undue influence in the way that people think about their beautiful data. And that, I think, is problematic. But I don't think that we should be discounting how much interesting work has been done on, I'll plug someone else, the Reza Shadmia's recent work on the cerebellum in the marmoset. I mean, he's a friend of mine, obviously, but that's a tour de force. I mean, that is extraordinary sort of population level Sherringtonian work. I mean, it's just extraordinary, right? That work.
So you're saying population level, you're talking about population of neurons, right?
Yes. Yeah, populations of neurons. I think that he really shows it at a granular level, how you get something constructed by a population that you couldn't get otherwise. And it's beautiful work, right? Now, it's interesting that, when he's shown me this incredible work, that there's a temptation sometimes to use the word predictive model and things like that. And I say to him, I don't think you need to say that.
I mean, we can discuss physiology in its own,
Yeah, but it's just great work. I mean, it's very, very, very informative. It's like the cerebellar version of the beautiful work that David Robinson did on eye movements,
Hmm.
right? I know that Reza was very inspired by what David Robinson did when it came to eye movements and moved into the cerebellum and took that mixture of physiology, behavior, and computational modeling to really teach us stuff, right?
Hmm.
And, Person in the work she's doing of similar kind for, prehension in the rodent. I mean, I think this is all beautiful Sherringtonian work in subcortical structures and below. I like all that kind of neuroscience, Madhu. I think it's now what the right conceptual, theoretical, unifying framework for all that is a different question, right? Is there such a thing?
Yeah,
And
and
predict,
it's an
you
important
know,
question because you have a tendency to find, those beautiful concepts when they don't exist, that unifying
well,
structures here.
I think that's right. In other words, Grace Lindsay, in her book Models of the Mind, which is really well written,
Yeah, it's a
it's a
beautiful book.
it is great on that chapter she has on, I don't know what she calls it, big theories or theories of everything, but she has that, right? She's got integrated information theory, free energy principle, and one other. I can't remember what the other one is. But yeah, I mean, there is a desire to come up with compressed, unified theories of all this lovely empirical work. Um, I'm not such a big fan of it. I'm a splitter, not a lumper,
Yeah.
you know. Uh, so yeah, I mean, I tend to be a critic of a lot of neuroscience, but I don't want that to mean that I don't think that there's a lot of work that genuinely is fascinating. Um, the work that Stuart Baker's done before I was working with him, the work
Hmm.
that Red's doing, the work that Abby's doing. I mean, it's
Yeah, I mean, physiological grounded work is mostly beautiful.
don't you think? I mean,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah,
I'm very much, it's interesting that words like physiology, anatomy, and psychology, they're going a little bit out
yeah,
of fashion,
yeah.
right? I like those words more than the new ones. Do you know what I mean?
Hmm. No, I agree with you. I mean, this has been the challenge for instance, dynamical systems. So I use fluid dynamics and those kind of methods. And one of the missing piece there is that there's a lot of talk about fluctuations and patterns and long range correlations, but tracing back those things to physiology and make predictions which are physiologically grounded, known understanding of the physiology, rather than just talking numbers and coming up with theories based on those numbers are two different things. So that
Yeah.
has been a gap in the dynamical system framework as well. We
But I
can.
also think, but I also think that, but I say all that I've said,
uh,
but then I love, the work that Adrian Hayes has done, all this wonderful sort of cognitive science on the motor system and on habits and beautiful work.
mhm.
And then the work that people like Chaz Firestone do in cognitive
Yeah, yeah.
science,
Hmm.
beautiful stuff. And they are proud, at least with Chaz, to not have the word neuro in there, right? In other
Hmm.
words, they say I'm a cognitive scientist, not a cognitive neuroscientist,
Hmm.
right? So, in
Hmm.
other words, there's an irony that if you believe in emergence and levels of explanation and objects, then I think psychological objects and cognitive science experiments and the stuff that Adrian's done, where you don't have to talk about neurons at all,
Hmm.
and then you get the beautiful physiological work where you do talk about neurons, like Reza,
Hmm.
um, it's kind of the in between that I find difficult when psychological constructs are laid on top of neural constructs,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Where there's this slippage. then that's when I begin to have problems.
So okay, let's go back to the levels of description. So can you relate this to Mars? So do you subscribe to Mars level of description of, of cognitive function or not? And do you see there
Well,
has
I
to
mean,
be different level?
I do. I mean, I think a lot of people get very confused about Ma,
Hmm.
right? Because he's talking about levels of realization. He's not talking about a neural hierarchy, right?
Hmm.
He's
Of
not,
course, of
you
course.
can be just as, you can be just as Marian about a dendrite as you can be
Yeah.
about prefrontal cortex,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Um, Oh, I mean, to the degree that I think a lot of cognitive science and behavioral science is algorithmic science, right?
Hmm.
In other words, when Reza started fitting state space models to adaptation, to, visual mode adaptation and force field adaptation, that was a very algorithmic description of what was going on, right? There's a learning rate and there's a retention factor, right? And then you may have more than one learning rate and more than one retention factor, right? It's that is a algorithmic description of what's going on. And and it can predict other experiments out of sample. Very interesting. Um, and then, people like me come along and go, well, maybe there are other learning algorithms buried in there that you didn't see, that in fact there are explicit strategies in there, that there are reward-based algorithms in there, as well as error-based algorithms. And you go, look at this, you've got this weighted set of algorithms that combined reproduce the net behavior that you see. That's extremely interesting, right? And there's no implementation there at all, right?
Hmm.
It's very pretty algorithmic decomposition of the behavior, right? So I think Ma would go, yeah, you have basically explained what the input-output functions are to get the job done.
But 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 is that input output function for the job done is your description, or is it actually brain's strategy, the central nervous system strategy?
Well, I mean, you have to do careful experiments, right? In other words, if you begin to show, make predictions in other experiments, you show generalization patterns, right? Um, what's the name of the philosopher? John Morrison, I think. Oh my God, I'm just blanking on his name, but he presented some nice work. Um, but yeah, I'm blanking on his name right now. I hate that when that happens. But yeah, I mean, yes, you can always say, like we did in the Neuroscience Needs Behavior paper in 2017,
Hmm.
that sometimes you need to go in to the neural structure to break the tie between alternative algorithmic descriptions of what's going on. And that may be a quicker way to picking one over another versus doing ever more careful experiments to try and rule out one over the other based on purely behavioral data. But you can certainly reduce the space of possible models through
Hmm.
very clever behavioral experimentation, right? And sometimes you can't. But
Hmm.
in the end, whether as we argued in that paper, a lot of the neural data are often confirmatory of the behaviorally derived algorithmic description rather than qualitatively changing the way that you were imagining it.
Yeah.
I mean, when you talk about, temporal difference learning with model-free reward prediction errors, right? In other words, Diane and colleagues confirmed it with the monkey data. They didn't qualitatively change their algorithmic understanding of it. Now, there has been subsequent work where you could argue the neural data may indeed be updating the algorithmic description, But in the end, the neural data are retranslated into an algorithmic description, right? You
Mhm.
don't switch out the algorithmic description with a neural one. You use the neural data to update the algorithmic description. So I think the algorithmic MAR level is the one that we're all really working at, is my view.
Okay.
Right? But that's not to say that you don't send
Mm-hmm.
out pounds
Mm-hmm.
to get neural data, but you don't switch out the algorithmic description with
Yeah.
a neural one. You use the neural one to update the algorithmic description.
Okay, so do we need that? So for instance, I myself have cited internal models and things like that during, in some of the papers I published during my PhD. But lately I have moved away from, any algorithmic process. And all I do is study a behavior in the lab, with whatever the machines, and just, model the data in the sense, describe the data using, some methods, and just talk about those patterns, and not infer anything about the algorithm, or higher level, what at a function level, what might be happening.
In other words, just so I understand,
Yeah.
um, when you get explained the iterative steps that occur in temporal difference learning,
Hmm.
are you denying that you're saying that we should not even talk about temporal difference learning anymore? We should just talk about patterns?
No, no, I'm not saying that. I was asking you, a different question with like this. So I have moved away from inferring, and I'm just focusing myself right now on those patterns and the description and understanding those patterns. What if I just stay there and I don't
But
move to
then,
the
but
other
then,
level?
but then if you want to switch out explanation with description,
Yeah.
it's a different scientific project, right? In other words, I think that having a theory of black holes is more interesting than just describing them, right? Now,
Hmm.
my brother David wrote a piece about the difference between sort of predicting and explaining. But the interesting thing is about complex systems that it seems as though they have effective theories possible at some level of coarse graining,
At some level of
right?
course
That's
training, yes. Yeah.
so what's fascinating is it seems as though
Hmm.
for phenomena, there seems to be a place where you can develop an effective theory that is compressed and screened off from all the details.
Yeah.
And an effective theory,
Hmm.
in order for a human to comprehend it, and let's be honest, as Hank Direct in his book, Understanding Scientific Understanding, humans need compressed
Yeah.
explanations. Otherwise, it's not science, right?
Hmm.
Um, so if you want to give up on the scientific enterprise, you want to give up on compressed, understandable explanations, okay. And maybe one can say two things that they're not the right way to do science in the first place,
Hmm.
or not everything will be compressible in that way. Um,
Or maybe at certain point in time. Maybe we are just premature to compress a lot of things
you, you,
right
you,
now.
you, you,
Yeah.
you could say that, sort of, it may well be that the conceptual frameworks with which we build our compressed algorithmic description explanations are making them not be actual explanations. We're coming up with the wrong explanation because we're data poor and theory heavy or something like that. I mean, although a lot of people tend to say the opposite, but I I don't quite know what the problem is. In other words, I tend to like the ability to do experiments which you test alternative hypotheses and you come up with some form of coarse-grained effective explanation of what's going on.
No,
You
no,
know,
no, 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 of course, of course, of course.
I don't think that
But
Hodgkin and Huxley were not coming up with an algorithmic explanation for the action potential, right? They did. They came up
No.
with a way that was, there were things they didn't know about.
Hmm.
Um, but I'm not convinced, and it's not my area, but I'm not convinced that a giant qualitative change has happened ever since. There may be details, but the basic idea
Hmm.
is the same.
I think you're right. I mean, even if you look at the theory of natural selection, it's an algorithm, right? The theory is an algorithm.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I'm not, and as I said, you can have alternative algorithms, you can update the algorithms. My friend, you know, Ida Mamenejad, you know, she's always saying that we haven't found all the algorithms yet. In other words, she says, there are algorithms that we need to still find, and there are architectures that we still don't fully understand.
Hmm.
But I'm very sympathetic to that. So I like physiological science and I like cognitive science. Um, and where I struggle more is the neural basis for the more cognitive stuff.
Hmm.
I'm quite okay with feeling some satisfaction with the neural basis of eye movements, Rez's beautiful work, spinal cord, descending pathways, and I like cognitive science. Where I struggle is with the way in which neural data are being looked at for the more cognitive stuff. But when you look at the stuff that Stefano Fusi and others are doing, it's interesting,
Hmm.
right? So maybe there will be a way to have a satisfactory neural theory of cognition. My guess is you won't. I think you'll always have an algorithmic Chas Firestone version of cognition with neural data updating the algorithmic explanation. I don't think you're going to draw neurons the way that you do when you explain the stretch reflex to people.
Yeah. Of course. Yeah.
Um,
Hmm.
right. So I think, as you've written about too, I think there are certain conceptual frameworks which I don't think are the right ones, but I'm kind of interested in the psychology and the physiology that is being done. I just don't know whether we'll have a unifying theory of it. That's
Hmm.
what and maybe you're not going to get that. Maybe that's just not the way to think about complex systems, is to think that there'll be a unifying theory of them.
Yes. So, okay. So we talked about humans, and you touched upon, bacteria and animals and animal models. What's the role of animal models in neuroscience? If we
Well,
have to go, yeah.
it's a very look. One of my best friends here at the Champlimau here in Lisbon is Joe Patton, who's done some very beautiful rodent work in the basal ganglia. And here's what I think, right?
Hmm.
If you're interested in what cortex does, right? Let's just say cortex, let's take, the equivalent in the bird and in mammals. And let's say you take the animal model that everyone likes to study, the mouse.
Hmm.
Okay. It would be really interesting to know how the assembly of the basal ganglia, the cerebellum, the motor cortex, and the brainstem, and the spinal cord, how that system generates the intelligence and movements of that little mammal, right? It's a very, very useful project. And I would say that the mouse is a good model to understand the interplay between cortical and subcortical structures, right?
Hmm.
It's an intelligent mammal that is doing some incredible stuff with this assembly. And it would be nice to know how a guided prehension movement is assembled from cerebellum, motor cortex, basal ganglia. Just that question at steady state. which is what's so beautiful about what Reza has been doing and others, is that and he's doing it in the marmoset, that you have, and it would be very odd, just like people say, oh, the action potential work was done in the squid giant axon. What about a human axon? It would be very odd, right? You
Yeah,
have
of
to
course.
believe that there is an induction. So, in other words, if you want to know about cortical subcortical interactions that lead to intelligent goal-directed behavior in a rodent, that's an incredible project. That is not different from studying stretch reflexes or studying action potentials or studying eye movements. It's the next step. Now,
Hmm.
but I wouldn't say animal model. It depends what you mean. If you said that the mouse is a model for studying mammalian cortex interaction with subcortical structures, and it's a model for that, just like the squid giant axon is a model for axons, yes. But sometimes what people say when they mean animal model is that they think this is the mouse version of a human behavior.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, there is some community which think, for
And,
instance, when
and,
you
and,
make
and I think that
models of,
there's a
yeah.
difference between saying the mouse is a great model to derive principles of cortical subcortical interaction, which it would be bizarre if anyone said it wasn't, right? Of course it
Mm-hmm.
is. It's a
Mm-hmm.
great place to do it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or that the marmoset's a really good place to work out how the cerebellum is contributing to movement.
Mm-hmm.
But that seems to me somewhat different from saying, um, is this mouse psychotic or depressed?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right? In other
Yeah.
words, is this a schizophrenic mouse? Right?
Mm-hmm.
Is this a dystonic mouse? I have a good friend, Bill Dower, who's a neurologist, neuroscientist, who is interested in dystonia, and he questions whether the behavior in the animal models is the behavior you see in humans. Right? So
Right.
that's the notion of homology, this is where it gets tricky. But, I've done mouse work, I'm doing monkey work, I've done mainly human work. And I think that as long as the question you're asking is based on the belief that the induction is not crazy, that it's not crazy to think that the action potential in the squid giant axon is going to be qualitatively different than it is from any other axon.
Yeah.
And you can use both perceived structural similarities, evolutionary histories. You can come up with reasons to see why the induction is reasonable. And I think that the induction, that working out how the cerebellum, basal ganglia, and the cortex interact to produce a prehension movement in the mouse is not going to be miles away for how prehension movement is made in a primate. Right?
True. Mm-hmm.
So
I,
it all depends what it is you're asking of the model,
yeah.
right?
And I think it's the projection of those human or those cognitive concepts from those animals, like whether the mouse is delusional or not. Those are the one who which tend to garner, the most of the criticism when it comes to the animal model. If it if you're talking about, homology between, structural or functional, the role of, for instance, cortical loops, it's I don't think it garners any criticism.
Yeah, and I think what happens, and my brother wrote about this too, he said, be careful when you move without realizing it from model to metaphor, right?
Yes, 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 right.
And
Yeah,
I think that one can't
yes.
always know. So in other words, that one of the things that, you know, um, is this notion of decision making, right? In other
Mm-hmm.
words, that word is subject to all sorts of metaphorical abuse,
Yeah.
right? Deciding to go to, you know, Yale for college um, is not the same as deciding at the moment of waking to wake up, right? In other
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
words, you don't, when you open your eyes, when you
Mm-hmm.
wake up in the, it's not because you decided to wake up, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I don't know.
Agree.
I, I, I or your spinal cord doesn't decide to move the left leg and then the right leg and then the left leg
Yeah.
and then the right leg,
Hmm.
right? So
There's a lot of
that
confliction. Yeah.
so you got right. So you get a word which has a certain psychological meaning, and then you imbue other phenomena that are not anything like that kind of thing with that same property. And that I do not like.
Yeah. And then those metaphors become myths as well over time, when you publish enough articles on topic. So there's a model to metaphor to myth trajectory.
Sure. In other words, I just think it's really difficult, right? In other
Mm.
words, the thing is this conversation we're having, which I'm very appreciative of you trying to bring these conversations into the light, is that these conversations don't happen as much as they should,
Yeah.
right? It's almost as though the more interesting aspects of the enterprise are tacitly there and don't need to be explicitly talked about. But I don't think that's correct.
Oh, but why do you think that's the case? So I have discussed this issue, and I feel that, myself in my life in general, because I had this fantasy idea of science, growing up. That fantasy is not true in all respects. Is it because of the sociology, like some collective behavior dynamics, which has changed over time out of the resources or out of the distribution? Or some people believe that we have a reduction in the density of people who are interested in topics. We have a lot more people now, a lot more scientists, but the rate of increase in the number of people doing science is much more than people who are actually interested in or passionate about the phenomena. So why
Well,
where
I
do you
mean,
think is the
I
cause?
mean, I think science is a career, not just a passion, right? In other words,
Yeah.
it's not, if you say to a scientist it should be as precarious and as uncertain as deciding to be a poet for a living,
No, it's not. Yeah.
but people go, no, I don't want it to be as precarious as being a poet or a painter.
Right, right.
I want it to sort of have, I want to have both the security of a career
Hmm.
and the claim to the passionate curiosity of some of those other careers which are less safe.
Yeah.
Once you have a career structure in place which allows you to get paid, have security, and not be the impoverished artist living in the outskirts of a city,
Hmm.
then of course you're going to start optimizing to keeping the career, right? And not to your initial curiosity that got you involved in the first place,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm. Yeah.
Right. Same thing happens, Jeffrey West has written a lot about this in his work on scaling, which he says that when you set up a company to solve problem X, eventually the problem as you get bigger is not X, it's keeping the company going.
Yes.
In other words,
Yeah. Hmm.
the beginning, it was an outward problem or curiosity that you built the enterprise for. But at some point, the enterprise itself becomes the point, right?
Right.
And you stop looking out at the world or at the problem. The problem is staying on course or keeping the company solvent.
Hmm. Yes.
Um, and that's what I think happens is that I've always said you optimize to the wrong cost function. You optimize to the structure within which you live rather than the outward problem that it was ostensibly started for in the first place.
So
And
another,
that's true of a corporation, and I think it can be true of a career.
yeah. So on that note, like, do you think that funding will solve that? So let's say we increase funding, overnight, twofold, threefold. Do you think that will suddenly change, or that would help to reduce this kind of calcification, or do you think that's not about the money? That's about something else?
Well, I definitely, well, I mean, I don't know whether lots of money would be the only solution, but when you look at a time, let's say the time when Eric Kandel was coming up
Hmm.
and 60% of grants were funded and you were doing your stuff, right? Or
Yeah.
the Malone Longs were coming up with DBS.
Hmm. Yeah.
And Malone DeLong has said that, if he had to do that R01 by R01, it would have been very difficult, right? So in other words, I'm saying that feeling like you can have job security and take risks and spend time over years worrying about a problem
Hmm.
versus very, very low funding rates, very competitive environments, having to say what you think people want to hear. In other words, you just have to frenetically try and get yourself to stay funded in this very, very, precarious funding environment. Can't be good for imagination and thought, right? It's just impossible.
Yes. Yeah.
So, in other words, whether lots of money will make suddenly everyone more creative is an open question, but no money and the situation right now is going to threaten
Yeah.
deep, slow thought over fast and shallow thought, right? I mean,
Yes, I agree.
so it's just horrible. It leads to tension and stress and
Hmm.
anxiety.
Yeah.
Can't be imaginative and thoughtful when you're marinating in your own stress hormones all the time, right?
Yes, of course. And you have constant deadlines, like and deadlines for grants come up with the whole, bureaucracy and the work and the preparation and everything.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
that's true.
I think there's a difference between being an exuberant intellectual bounding about looking at the wonders of the world
Hmm.
versus trying to be a successful academic.
They do
But
converge though.
what was that?
They do converge as well, right? I mean, it's not that they don't converge.
What do you mean?
That we have a lot of romantics who are very successful scientists as well, from every standpoint, successful academicians as well. So there have been
Yeah,
romantics as well
and
as
I don't.
yeah,
There are. I mean, I don't know what the ratio is. I don't know how
yeah.
many. I've mentioned people who I very much admire. I mean, someone like Reza. He he's always cared more about the puzzle, the question, and then we've had our disagreements over conceptual frameworks and shepherding your favorite one over another.
Mhm.
But that's not done because of a desire to please anyone else or get funding. It's not. It's about your hypotheses and your way of interpreting the world. Now that's fine. That's an intellectual debate,
Yeah.
right?
Hmm.
You have a debate about, I think representational art's better than abstract art, and I will tell you why. And there you're having an argument about your way of seeing things. But it's not informed by how you're funded or how you're promoted, or you're just having an intellectual fight.
Right, right.
Now, and I'm just saying that
Hmm.
I've found that there aren't that many people who are really having the interesting intellectual fights. I think
Hmm.
that I love, but I just there aren't that many people that I feel are doing that.
Yeah, that I mean there's a lot of fun in that combative nature of science, and I really enjoy that personally. So right now I'm doing a lot, with my projects, like which is one-sided basically. Writing is more like one-sided combat because you don't have an instant argument from the other side,
Yeah, I mean,
But
just sure. I mean, you've been going after one thing after another. All I'm saying is you have to be a little careful
Mhm.
that they don't get seen as screeds, right? In other words, that you don't want to become a universal hater, right? In other
Yeah.
words, I think
Hmm.
one has to, it's a delicate balance between legitimate differences of opinion, like, I've had with various scientists, but there are moments when you do want to sort of say there's a whole, like the paper that you wrote to me about that I wrote with Tamar Makin on cortical reorganization.
Hmm.
You know, we took several years, over 2 years, to write that article, but we methodically went through every single result, right? In other
Yeah.
words, we just said, let's go through the results painstakingly and look at what was found, what was not found, what it was interpreted as. In other words, I think that if one's going to go up against things like prediction, internal models, reorganization, then one has to be quite sober in one's tone and one has to kill with the data, right? Go, right, this didn't show what you think it showed this. This didn't show what you think it showed this. In other words,
Hmm.
what I think what one has to avoid is doing sociology or
Yeah.
psychology on the believers.
Hmm.
And one has to, and I would say, it's fun to be a little bit mocking, but I think one
Yeah.
has to be a little careful with that
Hmm.
because it's not going to have the desired effect anyway,
Yeah. That
right?
I've done
In
only
other
for
words,
one character, but
well, yeah, I
typically,
wasn't,
yeah.
I'm just saying
Yeah.
that,
Yeah.
that it's
No, I
you
see your
know,
point. I actually
yeah,
love that. I love that article, especially because it goes through those papers and actually has original figures from those papers, right? With
yeah. I
the
mean, Tamar. I
yeah,
mean, that's all Tamar. I mean, Tamar was really, did an incredible job of
yeah.
organizing those figures and picking the right ones. I mean, it was an act of loving scholarship in my view. Um,
I'll actually put the link, in the show notes. It's a paper, one should read, especially anyone interested in neuroplasticity.
yeah, I mean,
Hmm.
if they say so myself, and I think because at least all I can say is that it was an attempt to question a pervasive notion by taking a look ourselves, and we laid it all out. In other words, we are more than open to people coming back and saying, well, no, that wasn't the right interpretation, or two, you didn't consider these experiments. We've had very constructive arguments with, Marina Bedney at Hopkins, who doesn't agree. Teresa Jones hasn't fully agreed. In other words, that's fine,
Hmm.
right? The job is to do your honest best to present an argument based on the data and say, I can't think about this in another way. That might be our deficiency, but we just don't get it, right?
Yeah.
And, Adrian Hayes, in the work that he's done on habits and the work that he's doing on internal models, he's just a super thoughtful person who just doesn't think that it is doing what people think it's doing. That's pure intellectual work, right? That is what honest intellectual work and scholarship should be.
Hmm.
Um, but there are many, many enemies of promise, as Cyril Connolly called it, right? There are many things that get in the way of that clean intellectual work. I mean, there are rivalries, there are competitions, there's low funding, you need to be promoted, you need to seem different from others. I mean, you know this very, very well. There's
Hmm.
a way to not be particularly intellectually deep and do quite well in a structure that has all sorts of other incentives.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. And
But
and and it pays really well as well, it's
well,
let's say it's more predictable and less stressful to be like that, to take that trajectory.
so I
So
don't know. You know what? I don't think so. There's a wonderful computer scientist, mathematician,
uh,
Chris Moore at the Santa Fe Institute, who I was with in Scotland, and students were asking about this. it's gotten to the point where it's so hard to get a job and there's all this blah blah. And Chris basically gave this lovely little response saying that, for him, to the degree that he was successful, it was because he really just went after what he cared about. He said, I don't think, he said, I don't think I would ever have been able to do what I've done if I had just been tactical or strategic about it.
Hmm.
So in other words, I'm not completely convinced that it's true that gaming the system is easier or less stressful. I'm not sure about that. I'm sure there's some kind of cost to that.
Or maybe it's just about the personality. So it's just about the individual, like, so you are on your basal rate of happiness or stress, and you just take the trajectory which basically, helps you out. It's like it's not fungible. The strategies are not fungible
and
for
also
an
in
individual.
any, and also, I'm a tennis fanatic. I love watching tennis, and
Hmm.
you know, it's very difficult to have a successful career in financially once you fall out of the top 200, right?
Hmm.
But you have to be there to be beaten by the top 10, right? So in other
Yeah.
words, so you're needed in the structure,
Hmm.
even though no one finds you particularly impressive, you don't make much money, you're there to sort of be beaten by the more interesting people. There's a kind of brutality to it, right?
Yeah. Hmm. I mean
Maybe
that's so true. Yeah.
do you see what I mean? I'm just saying
Yeah.
that maybe you can't be the intellectual and creative scientist if there aren't lots of other people in the structure not
Yeah.
being very impressive. I mean, I'm not sure that everyone can be great. I'm not sure if that's
Yeah, no, I agree with you. Also, if I often give example to, people that there are less faculty positions, research-based faculty positions in any particular subfield every year than there are Olympic medals in a lot of sports. So we are talking about the top performers here in terms of, whatever the metrics are. So we are talking about these set of people. It's a very, very chosen set of people. So dynamics has to be different and constrained, in ways that you just mentioned, like top 200 people, for instance, in tennis.
yeah. You think it's very different,
It's very different.
but there are
It's,
lots of. But you mean it's getting to the point where there aren't 200 faculty positions anymore?
of course, they're not. I mean, they're very, very few. So we are
That
talking
wasn't
about,
always the case. That wasn't always the case, right?
no, that wasn't always the case.
Right.
So we
So
are
what I'm
talking
saying
about,
is under these conditions of extreme scarcity,
yeah,
I just think all bets are off. I don't think one can talk about healthy things anymore when the
mhm,
situation is so unhealthy,
exactly,
right?
exactly,
I think it just becomes a distorted,
exactly. Any
it's just
imagination comes up with a risk. So, for instance,
yeah,
like you miss grand deadlines, or every year you miss, on your tenure clock, you're basically risking, basically destabilizing the whole 30, 40 years of effort one has put so far, to be there.
yeah.
So,
So
so
I mean, it may well be we've reached a point of such distortion and scarcity
yeah,
that normal things and incentives can no longer really work. So
yeah,
it's like
exactly.
being very poor and very hungry. It just doesn't make your behavior normal anymore, right? You just can't. It's
Yeah,
not fair to expect people who don't know where their next meal is going to come from.
it is similar
When,
situation.
yeah, I just don't. I think it's distorting. You
Yeah.
just can't. You
And then
know.
it will also select those people, right? Who can live under those pressure and, thrive. I mean, romantics, it will steer away romantics in general.
I think that's right.
So,
I think that's right. I think that. Yeah. I mean, I think there are a lot of similarities between the weird commercial art market and science, right? Sort of
mhm.
very strange, untalented artists get to the top in some cases,
Yes.
right? It's
It's very
you
similar.
know, Yeah, it is similar. I don't think that Andy Warhol was he was an amazing exploiter of the rising art
Socially.
market
Hmm.
rather than I mean he was a great draftsman actually, but in the end I think he was very good at exploiting the new commercial realities.
Hmm.
And there are Andy Warhol like characters in science.
Of course, all over the place. So, and then, also, I think, I don't know, I mean, things have changed in science definitely over time. I mean, I mean, I don't want to go too much into sociology, but I mean, things have changed. I mean, I cannot I'm not saying that I want to be like this, but you can be an amazing, scientist and a romantic and a completely socially awkward asshole, let's say, right? And there were people like that, but now it's very hard to survive as a, you might be an asshole, but again, you have to have this a halo effect on you, like, you have to somehow fit in the whole ecosystem well.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I've always been a bit of a troublemaker. I've always made my opinions very clear. I've always been a little bit combative. I'm sure that's hurt me in some ways. But I have to say that as long as you're not sort of one note, you don't want to sound like you're screaming all the time,
Hmm.
right? And two, you want to avoid ad hominem attacks. And three, you don't want the young around you to feel intimidated, right?
Hmm.
In other words, but if you have some humor in your position, you're willing to be criticized back, you're willing to admit when you're wrong,
Hmm.
um, then I think you can be a bit rebellious and a little bit outspoken. But I think, you just have to avoid all those things that I said. I think that,
Yeah. Hmm.
and in the end, I think most importantly is that your work has to speak for itself. In other words, there's no
Yes.
point being a critic if you haven't built up a body of work that
Yeah.
allows you to
Right.
take that stance,
It
right? In other
it has
words,
to have a credible foundation.
you have to, right? You have to
Yes.
have done the work. You have to
Yes.
have been, um, you know, you can't go straight to being an aphorist, right?
Hmm.
You need to have your novels and your books
Yeah.
first. And
Of
then
course.
your book of aphorisms gets published, but you don't go straight to aphorisms. You know
Yeah.
what I say?
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Of course. Of
and
course.
and I think it's similar
Yeah.
here that you
Yeah.
have to have created a body of work,
Yeah.
and I think building an identifiable body of work that speaks for itself is hard.
Hmm. It's true. And it takes time. So John, coming back to science, coming back to your core expertise of stroke. So now, if you look at motor disorders, we have motor disorders comes in all flavors and how they manifest. So for instance, Parkinson's, Alzheimer and other dementia, it takes some time, right? They are slow evolving disorders and more diffused, across different parts of the brain, central nervous system, compared to, for instance, stroke, which is a assault which happens very, very fast. And then you have very different kind of disorders resulting from those. So, are there specific ways in which we study disease? Are there specific theories which, okay, let me reframe the question. Like, how do these differences frame or inform our theories of motor control or cognition differently?
Well, it's an interesting question, right? In other words, the first thing is, right, the neurobiology of the disease process and
Yeah.
how to fix it is different from the neuropsychology of the disease process,
Hmm.
right? So, in other words, if you have a prefrontal lesion or you have a neurodegenerative condition, cross-sectionally,
Yeah.
the nature of the deficits may be very similar,
Yeah.
right? So
Mhm. But
if
in
you're
one
interested,
case,
yeah, go ahead.
we see adaptation and we see, organismal functions intact and adapting. Like hearing loss can also be put in the same kind of, bucket, or loss of vision over time can also be, kept in the same bucket, where you have very different kind of uh, trajectories compared to rapid assaults.
No, I agree. In other words, again, if you want to say, look, if you're slowly losing your hearing or you're slowly degenerating, then the slow deterioration in the behavior and the slow deterioration of the tissue, those two slow things, the tissue dying and the behavior degrading, both give you time to both behaviorally compensate and neurally compensate. Yes,
Hmm.
right. Versus the sudden destruction of a large amount of real estate by a stroke or traumatic brain injury. So, people have talked about slow versus fast plasticity, famous experiments done in rodents, right? I can't cite who did them, where if you remove an area in 4 quarters with intervals in between, even though the net volume at the end is the same as if you took it all out at once, the animal that had it taken out in quarters does better than the one who had it taken all out at once.
Hmm.
Right. So, but in the end, you have to decide, are you interested in the recovery process? Are you interested in the disease process? Or are you interested in the cross-sectional deficit? They're all slightly different questions, right? Now,
But
if the cross-sectional deficit is the same, so eventually the degenerative process reaches an equivalence point with a lesion, is there a fundamental difference in the algorithmic understanding of the deficit? I'm not sure.
hmm. But fundamental difference in how we will approach the treatment.
Yeah, but the work
Hmm.
understanding how something, the using disease as a natural experiment to have algorithmic theories of the processes lost versus trying to fix the system that's broken at the tissue level.
Hmm.
I mean, that's what's so fascinating, right? Is that you can treat a psychiatric condition with an implementational level drug, or you can treat it with meaning in the form of words with talk therapy,
Yeah.
right? And it's
Hmm.
amazing that you can actually have an impact
It is amazing. Yeah,
with meaning.
yeah. So the most fascination question to me, in neuroscience has been that how is it that somebody just saying like 3 letters, I hate you, which is just basically a force, a pattern of force on your ears, on your eardrum. I hate you can destroy your whole day and can lead to depression. And somebody saying I
Well,
love you at the
Dan
same
Dennett,
time, you know.
Daniel Dennett had an example, I think it was in a Times Literary Supplement years ago, where he says, somebody's walking towards a box and you say, stop, there are snakes in it,
Mhm.
and your muscles contract in your legs as you stop. So meaning
Yeah.
made muscles contract.
Hmm.
Incredible, right?
Yeah. Michael Turvey used to say, I haven't heard, but that's what Damien says. How do light go into muscle? That's the question.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's so, these are very subtle things, the tissue damage process, the compensatory process, the cross-sectional neuropsychological deficit. I mean, these are all slightly different projects in the same patients,
Hmm.
right? Um, but I'm interested in both. I'm very interested in stroke and what it tells you about the biology of the healthy system, and I'm interested in how to fix it. And stroke allows you to do both neuropsychology and do repair, you know.
Hmm. I see. Okay. Something about your book, Broken Movement,
Mm.
because it's a very differently written book, and also it does not come with a resolution.
Well, no, I wrote that book just because I wish somebody else had written that book for me. I
Hmm.
wish there were one book that sort of explained the history of the field, that explained some of the motor control concepts, explained some of the concepts behind the treatments. There was also, um, Tom wrote all the molecular and cellular chapters. Um, it was like one-stop shopping. It could be a place, both in terms of the positions we took plus the citations, where you could get a lay of the land. Oh, okay, so that's what the mouse experiments show. That's what the monkey experiments show. That's
Yeah.
what the human experiments show. Oh, that's what TMS showed. That's what robots show. In other words, it was really just a place where you really have to know a lot of different things to cope with that field,
Yeah.
right? In other words,
Hmm.
it's a lot, right?
It's a
And
lot. Yeah.
so I just wanted to have a place where you could at least get a lay of the land. It was a little bit similar to when Adrian and I spearheaded the motor learning chapter we wrote back in 2019.
Yeah.
We wanted a place where somebody could go, oh my God, where can I at least know what the main paradigms are, whether it's visual motor adaptation, sequence learning, de novo learning, and it's amazing how much that article has been looked at, right? In other words,
Hmm.
because people wanted a place where they could at least get a sense of the landscape. And that was the same with the stroke book. But I would
Hmm.
write a very different book now. Maybe I will if I wrote a second edition. Many, many, many things would change in that book.
So for instance, I mean, it's not a very old book.
No, but well, for example, I don't say anything about um, epidural spinal cord stimulation.
Hmm.
I have different views now about what might be happening in chronic stroke, why you can get impairment reductions, what is training actually doing? Um, what do we, the new work about what the descending pathways are doing, where we think synergies come from. Yeah, I think that it would be different. Every chapter would be different in terms of updates, and there would be things which were brand new, like not enough talk about vagal nerve stimulation, nothing about dentate stimulation, um, more work on neural networks. I think it would be a different book. I think there would be a qualitative difference in some of the way that I would conceptually frame the stuff
Hmm.
now. And maybe I'll get to that.
Okay. And why do you think that stroke is such a hard topic? I mean, the amount of both effort and funding which has gone into stroke, has been a lot, right, over the years.
Not as much.
And
It's not as much as, disproportionately compared to Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. That's
yeah,
not true,
not
right?
true.
Hmm. Um, I think partially, multiple sclerosis, autism,
Hmm.
they get a lot more attention, and people say, well, yeah, because stroke is what happens to people over 65. It's not so tragic.
No, but now there are more and more young strokes, right?
That's right. I think, you know, I, and it's difficult, right? In other words, I remember as a kid, you'd swat a fly
Hmm.
and it would be dead on the windowsill. Unless you squashed it, you'd look at it and go, why is it dead? In other words, what's changed in its configuration that makes it no longer alive? It's sort of weird that you sort of broke it.
Hmm.
Do you know what I
Yeah,
mean?
yeah, yeah, yeah,
That's why I called it broken movement. It's like, what did you break? Do you know
yeah.
what I mean?
Hmm.
And that's a little bit like stroke is you took this beautiful,
Yeah,
smooth running system and you broke it.
yeah, exactly. And this is what I was trying to get at when I said Parkinson's versus, slow moving disease versus stroke. You actually break it in stroke, which you don't break it in, other
Yeah,
disorders.
yeah, I know. Yeah, I'm not, again, as I said, I think it's, when something is broken, It's such a delicate mechanism.
Mhm.
What makes you think you can fix it, right? It's a little bit, if you were to knock down a building and it was a pile of bricks and someone said to you, fix it, it would be a bit odd. You'd go, I can't, right? It's broken. It's broke. It's right. So in other words, then they say, okay, I'm going to punch a hole in one side of the building,
Mhm.
fix that,
Mhm.
right? But at a certain point, whether it's a car or a building, you say it's a write-off, right? It can't be fixed,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. And this is
Stroke,
what.
stroke at a certain point,
Mhm.
you could say, with respect to getting the lost behavior back, it's always a write-off. Just be glad that you didn't lose any more behaviors. But the ones you've lost aren't coming back, right? And
Yeah. And this is what we don't
and
want to
that,
believe, right? Generally. I mean,
well,
we have to.
I don't think it's completely true. I think we know it's not true that you can look better than you do. You can go back to more normal than you're looking.
Mhm.
There is latent residual architecture with the right physiological and behavioral intervention can get you closer back to normal than you think you can go, right?
Mhm.
So, you have a patient who can't extend their elbow, and then you stimulate their spinal cord and they're extending their elbow. In other words, and that's sub-threshold stimulation. Otherwise, you still need to make the voluntary movement.
Mhm.
Suddenly you're voluntarily opening your elbow. So latent, the architecture can do it.
Yeah.
So you can get closer to normal. It's just that you don't seem to be able to do it on your own, especially in the
Mhm.
chronic state.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
So how do you unmask and bring online latent architecture?
Mhm. Right.
And that's fascinating to
So
me.
do you think epidermal, stimulation is that's where we are heading in strokeism?
I think stroke is going to have to go the same way that Parkinson's did. I mean, no one would say that
Yeah.
you're going to rehab your way out of Parkinson's disease, right?
Yeah, it has to be compensated
It has to
technologically
be,
or
or pharmacologically, right? And I
pharmacologically. Yeah.
think stroke is going to be that way too. You're going to have to combine behavior, physiology, and pharmacology to get full return.
Hmm.
And maybe assistive devices, right? I mean, imagine a
Yeah.
hybrid situation. You do immersive training, you do physiology, you do pharmacology, you build robotic assist, and you're basically this hybrid of restorative approaches and assistive approaches.
Yeah.
I think that's where we're going to go. And you'll be a post-stroke cyborg,
hmm
you know.
hmm
What's wrong with that,
Yeah,
right?
there's nothing wrong with it. I mean, we already have, so many things, like, continuous insulin injections and all these things are basically pacemakers or
Right, right. So I think we're just going to have to get the right weighting of restorative and assistive technologies,
Mhm.
and do our best to get you to be performing better.
Hmm. Perfect. Yeah, I think uh do you want to wrap up
Yeah, I think I
or
better. But
yes.
you and I could probably talk forever about 100,000 things.
Yes. Yeah. So John, yeah, because a lot of audience is much young audience, like graduate students or even undergrads. What's your message to young souls? I mean, I myself am not that old, so
I
I
mean, I
I
think I think
yeah.
my brother and I talk about this. I
hmm
think, like I said earlier, if you want to be a scientist and you just cannot help being curious, then you need to see it a little bit more like being a poet. You need to understand that this is not necessarily the road to security and stability. If you
hmm
want to be a doctor or if you want to be an aeronautical engineer and look after the engines of airlines, or you want to be a doctor, there you're providing a kind of service and expertise, like being a plumber or an electrician. But if you want to be a kind of scientist in the form of saying you want to be an artist, then you need to understand that that is going to be precarious. We do not have countries really wanting to pay you to do purely curiosity driven stuff, or to be a painter or a poet or a hip hop artist. You're not going to be paid to do that.
Mhm.
You'll be paid if you make it, right?
Yeah.
So I think science is a little bit more like art than they were willing to believe,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
And it's not a, you shouldn't think that there should be a structure in place. Well, maybe there should be, but there isn't, that is going to allow you to be a purely curiosity driven, exuberant intellectual. That's just not what we have in place any more than there's a place where you can be guaranteed a job as a poet,
Yeah.
right?
It's
So
it's
that's not
better. It's better than that. Yeah. Of course. It's much better than that.
it's better than that. But do you see what
Uh,
I mean?
hmm
And I think I think science is a calling. It's
hmm
not a guaranteed job. Again, I'm just saying what is the reality. I'm just saying
hmm
maybe we should employ more poets, but um, I think a lot of people think that science versus, skills like being a statistician or being an engineer or being a coder. In other words, there are many technical things you can become good at and you can be employed to do.
hmm
But if you want to do curiosity-driven science,
hmm
that's a rarer niche.
Yeah.
And even if you want to do that, you often have to teach or see patients part of the time. So I would say to young people, do you want to sort of be in the satellite subjects that live around science? Do you want to be a statistician? Do you want to be a roboticist, an engineer? Do you want to create databases? There are many, many, many professions around science where your skill set is like a service.
Yeah.
But if you want to be somebody who daydreams new theories and new ideas, and that's risky,
Yeah. That's a and few avenues to do that.
right? And that's what I mean. You should think about it like you're deciding you want to become a violinist. You're probably not going to make it.
Hmm.
I mean, I'm not trying to sound harsh or anything, but you know what I mean.
Yeah. The odds are stacked against you. And also you are competing. I mean, when you say you make it, it's like the top 200, of those romantics.
Yeah. And there's this wonderful book called History of Philosophies, where there aren't that many slots available within every given discipline, right? If you
hmm
think about, how many people can you think of? You take, fuzzy boundary of any given area or sub area, and you go, name me the top six people in that field. You start to slow down after you get to around six.
Yeah. That's so true.
Right, right. You start
Yeah.
going, okay, that person, that, and I go, oh, God.
Yes.
It's fascinating. It's almost like a magic number. Do you know what I mean?
And it happens when you are submitting a paper and it says, recommend reviewers. And at certain time in the pandemic, Elsevier had a policy for certain journals. You have to put 15 reviewers to get it, to be sent for review, 15 potential reviewers. And it was so difficult to find 15 people who you think can review the manuscript.
Yeah, exactly, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So there seems to be some mapping
hmm
between domains and how many humans can be in them.
Yeah.
That and it's not clear why that is.
I think yeah. I mean, a lot of these things come from complex systems, right? I mean, some kind of scaling laws.
Yeah, there must be something like that, right? what is it they say that 10% of the scientists in a field are responsible for 50% of the publications or something like that? I don't know. It's just
It's pretty
there
skewed.
must- it is skewed.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, whether that's just a sort of self-perpetuating thing, once you
It's both.
start.
I think it's organic as well as inorganic. Both forces go towards the same
Mhm.
skewness.
Mhm. So, I think like medicine or science, if you want to do the intellectual curiosity version,
Hmm.
you have to really love it. It's like saying I want to be an art historian. That's great. One of my best friends is an art historian.
Hmm.
You're not going to get rich doing that, right?
Right.
And there aren't many offered jobs to be an art historian, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
So I think it's healthier to see it in that way.
Right. Yeah, it keeps your expectations kind of checked,
Yeah, yeah.
which is good. Yeah.
And in a case, to be personal in a case like yours, when you are more intellectual and more curious and more roving, one has to avoid being frustrated that people aren't paying you to be you, right?
Yeah.
Because it just doesn't really seem to work that way.
It takes some time to realize and accept.
Yeah. Yeah.
True. So thanks, John. It was a really great conversation.
No,
Pretty
I really
packed.
loved it. Really loved it. No, it was great. Thank you so
Yeah.
much. It's fantastic you're doing this, and
Yes.
thanks
And
for inviting me.
and I think that was the first of more conversations we might have in the future.
Sure, absolutely. So you take care and tell me if you need anything for this particular one.
Sure. Thanks, John, and have a great day ahead.
Yeah, bye.
Bye.